Bhaduri, my colleague, professor at the Center for English Studies here, and known to everybody. And he's also, of course, served as a visiting professor at many universities in different parts of the world, and is off soon, next week, I think, to his new assignment as at the Erich Orbach Chair in World Literature at the University of Göttingen in Germany. Areas of his interest, and all our students know how wide a repertoire Saugata has in teaching and in research. It includes literary and cultural theory, popular culture, translation and comparative literature studies, and the cultural history of colonial Bengal, which is particularly relevant here. And he's only named, I think, the main relevant publication. It includes his book, Polycoloniality, European Transactions with Bengal from the 13th to the 19th century, that was published in 2020. So, Saugata.
So thank you very much to the students for thinking with me, and thank you, Rosinka, for writing this book. And it's really, it was a wonderful experience flipping through it. I can't say, I must confess, I couldn't read the whole of it. It's a rather fat book, but I did glance through it quite a lot and read significant parts of it. And thank you so much for writing it. As Rosinka says in her acknowledgements towards the end of the book, that's quite surprising that no book had yet been written, or at least when she was pursuing her doctoral degree at Oxford, no book had been written on the Young Bengal as a group. I mean, no individual book on Young Bengal itself. And which is surprising because the kind of contribution that Young Bengal as a group would have made and the kind of relevance that they would have had towards the formation of the entire political discourse to follow thereafter really makes it surprising that no book had been written on them, and singularly on them, and therein Rosinka's book really becomes a sort of a milestone. And let me just begin by talking about maybe the terms that occur in the title itself, which is two terms that stand out, which is first radical, so the idea of radical, and India, because they are probably the terms that would probably be the most questioned when someone takes up as to how a group that called itself Young Bengal and evidently worked only within Bengal, is it right to kind of give them the sobriquet of being the radicals, the first radicals of India, the whole of India? And second, the idea of radicality itself, the idea of radical itself. Were they radical? What were they radical about? What were their radicalness all about? So let me begin with that. The first one about Indianness is something that Rosinka already addressed in her inaugural remarks, in her opening remarks about the book. Because indeed, they really, Young Bengal as a group, and coming from Derosio's own claiming of India as his canvas and deliberately continuously using the term India in his numerous works, and also he designating himself also continuously as an East Indian rather than anything else, it's really not surprising that Young Bengal continuously aspires for the category called India. And so much so that the first political party formed, BBIS, on which again so little work exists, would have really aspired for India as a category. So this envisioning of an India, of some kind of a category called India, some kind of a political category called India, indeed starts. One could probably dig up some other archival sources and argue that it could have been used elsewhere too, in exactly this sense. But indeed, the Young Bengal would be credited with positing the political idea of an India, some kind of a unified India. Talking about radicals, this is again very important because if we are talking about radicalism per se, and that too probably decolonial, anti-colonial radicalism, it's not that the late 18th, early 19th century Bengal was completely unfamiliar with radicalism. because right from the 1760s onwards with the Fokishonnashi rebellion, which all of us are familiar with, I'm sure, from 1760s onwards, and thereafter moving to the Chua revolution for that matter, so which again we do know from the 1780s onwards, Chua revolution, and leading right up to the Farisi movement, which would have also led to numerous possibilities of even not just radicalism but also anti-colonial, decolonial radicalism, and the Wahhabi movement majorly in Bengal, leading right up to Titu Mir, who by the 1830s and 1831 would have already built up a bulwark of anti-colonial resistance, and so many other so-called radical anti-colonial formations. So can we really credit young Bengal to have been the fountainhead of the first radicals, so to say, when they were surrounded already for a few decades, for quite some time, by other equally radical, if not more radical, and probably more effectively anti-colonial movements all around. But here is where Rosinka really makes the most, let's say, provocative but also evocative insight, provides us with this insight that first of all we must understand, and wherein she also takes a methodological, should we say, picks up a methodological battle with certain other kinds of historiography, certain other kinds of historians, including of course the subaltern historiographers majorly, who would have definitely talked about these numerous movements that do not get talked about in our official historiography of radicalism in India, but we need to talk about, and we do know, and all of us now know the Fokishonnashi rebellion, all of us know Chua revolution, etc., etc. But is it that these are the only movements that should be credited with the sobriquet radicality? But more importantly, the second issue that she also raises in her book is that one must understand that the radicalness of a Farisi movement, a Wahhabi movement, or a Shonnashi rebellion, or the Chua rebellion was rooted in identitarian formations. And they were essentially therefore also bound to certain quasi-religious understandings of what one's battle lines for anti-colonial struggle should be. And this is where young Bengal kind of steps apart, because they formulate a completely, let's say, extra-religious, extra-identitarian, and therefore indeed radical mode of trying to conceive radicality. And this is where the radicalness of the young Bengal as a group indeed is different from so many other radical formations which were solidly attached to some kind of an identitarian affiliation. And this really makes them very special. Talking further about the radicalness of the Young Bengal group itself, some of the accusations that often get raised against Young Bengal is that, well, I mean, they were probably radical in their own right, they were doing all kinds of radical things, but they probably did not have much of an efficacy in terms of actually bringing about anything concrete in the landscape of the times. And the second allegation being that all the members of the Young Bengal group were themselves probably elite, upper caste, urban certainly, that they were, that cannot be denied much, but elite, upper class people, and probably dilettantes, probably generally decadent, etc. So the usual, because Young Bengal has been talked about a lot, but often from a relatively critical perspective, and not only from the conservative side, but also from what Rosinka calls, quoting, the semi-radicals, or half-radicals, what is the term? Sorry. Half-liberals. Half-liberals. So kind of drawing brickbats from all sides, so to say. But herein one must understand, and this is very succinctly pointed out in this particular book, that the Young Bengal as a group wasn't homogeneous. This presumption of ours that they were all some rich zamindar sons, this is utterly wrong. Because as she points out, that people like Radhanath Shikdar did not even have money, not just to pay his tuition fees, but even to have himself and his mother fed at the end of the day. Similarly, in terms of cost also, there would be one Chakraborty, after whom the Chakraborty faction of Young Bengal was named, and a few Mukherjees and all that. But equally, in equal proportion, not only would there be Mitros, Doctors, Ghoshas, etc., who kind of belong to the upper caste continuum, if not Brahminical, but also Mullahs, etc. And she points out that even the caste spectrum in terms of the young Bengal's representatives is not as simple as many of those who try to paint them in one brush of belonging to the elite echelons of society necessarily do. So then again, therefore young Bengal becomes a fairly heterogeneous group, comprising indeed urban people, urban males, no doubt about that, but coming from a fairly wide caste spectrum and a somewhat wide economic spectrum, and therefore they cannot be necessarily just brushed aside as belonging to this elite group. And similarly, their so-called decadence, which is very interesting because Michael Madhusudhan, who was not a member of the Young Bengal, he would come a generation later, though he would have been a college student in 1840s. The crucial year 1843, the year which Rosinka's book really talks about, himself, what I was going to say was that that fact that Michael himself would write, Michael Madhusudhan Datta, would himself write a farce like Ekeki Bole Shotrota, which would, so from a radical perspective, almost undercutting and lampooning the excesses of the so-called radical groups, suggests that there would be lines of internal self-critique almost woven into the Young Bengal group and their successors, so that we cannot really brush them again at one go as being nothing but a dilettante, a decadent set of people just primarily having beef and drinking wine, which much of the commonplace notions about Young Bengal revolve around, and generally trying to destabilize society without contributing meaningfully. So this wonderful book really paints Young Bengal in all its vicissitudes and suggests how the Young Bengal was indeed the fountainhead of a whole new political thinking of the colonial era and inaugurating a whole discourse of radicalism, and which would have thereafter kind of brought forth that kind of radicalism that we need to cherish today. And Rosinka's continuous references to, let's say, not just JNU, which she incidentally read out also, but our current situation, we're faced precisely within the so-called nationalist conundrum with a potential conservative radicalism versus a necessarily, let's say, for lack of a better word, identitarian nationalism or identitarian radicalism from the margins, caught between these two poles. How we need to probably build up a far more robust, secular, progressive mode of radicalism, and where Young Bengal and its continuity thereafter in what the left in India would have in different ways taken up, that probably becomes a template that we need to all the more cherish, which makes this book that much more relevant for our times. I have just one additional caveat to add, and also to kind of expand the scope of the book. One thing, and that's to also tag this particular book to my own hobby horse, which is polycoloniality, which is the idea that Bengal in that particular period and otherwise was not just ruled by the British, but the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, the Danish, and all would have contributed to this matrix of radicality. I would just kind of suggest, again provocatively perhaps, but as an addendum, that maybe one also has to look into the genesis of Young Bengal and the genesis of radicality, the possibility of their having crept in influences precisely from these non-British powers. Not only because Dirozio himself was a Luso-Indian, for lack of a better word, because his mother was kind of Anglo-Indian, I mean probably English. The father was a Luso-Indian certainly, not only because he was therefore of Portuguese descent rather than being English, but also because even the chapters, liberty, equality, fraternity, kind of recall clearly the slogans of the French Revolution, and Chandanagar, the French enclave, which is just a little away from Calcutta, it was already the site of radicalism right from the 1780s onwards, because at the time of the French Revolution, there was a revolution, it's called La Révolution de Chandanagar. So there was actually a decolonial revolution in Chandanagar which ousted the official regime there and set up templates of probably conceiving anti-colonial, decolonial thought, which would have percolated indeed into British Calcutta and would have definitely informed the Young Bengal because of their own possible polycolonial let's say, influencer, that is Dirosio, and also the radical, the general radical atmosphere that we've come over from French Bengal, from Chandanagar into. By the way, Shumanta Banerjee has a wonderful book called A Tale of Two Cities, Calcutta and Chandanagar. A book as if it's an occasional publication, it's a slim, very slim book. A Tale of Two Cities under colonial rule, Calcutta and Chandanagar, where he clearly almost suggests precisely this, that really much of the radicalism in Calcutta was predated in Chandanagar and probably almost modularly adopted, including certain social reforms which the Young Bengal as a group would have itself also probably brought about. And what is even more interesting, and with which I end, that Ratanath Shikdar, one of those very major figures within the Young Bengal spectrum, and whom Rosinka also mentioned in her brief reading, himself actually went, he resided in Chandanagar. He kind of withdrew from Calcutta, probably not altogether happy about the scenario in Calcutta. And Ratanath Shikdar finally spent his last few years in Chandanagar and was, is also, he lies buried in a churchyard in Chandanagar. But such a wonderful book, and thank you so much, Rosinka, for writing it. And I'm sure I've also exceeded my 10 minutes, but what a pleasure it has been reading at least parts of the book. And I'm sure the audience will also hereafter take it up and form this absolutely required template of reconfiguring the idea of radicalism with an altogether new genealogy of it to come from. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Saugata. If you want, already has raised a lot of points, which I'm sure will come up again in discussion.